Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we have several advances by the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are attempting to offset the Russian counteroffensive in the Kursk direction by redirecting some forces towards Lyubimivka and the surrounding settlements, conducting counterattacks, and regaining some control over areas, strengthening their flanks. The Russians continued their offensive operations towards Lyubimivka itself, and in the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians have made some advances and captured Stelmakhivka, and in the Chasiv Yar direction, the Russians have made an advance there as well. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have advanced within Lyubimivka, capturing central parts of the settlement, cutting it off into multiple parts. There's the northern parts and then the eastern parts remaining under Ukrainian control. The Russians are fighting in both of these areas, where the Ukrainian positions in the northern parts are more isolated than the eastern parts, making that a secondary position for the Ukrainians, while the main position is in the eastern parts. We also see that the Ukrainians launched a counterattack, recapturing the footholds the Russians had in Chasiv and recapturing Pokrovsky here along the Stelmakhivka river line. At the same time, the Ukrainians also counterattacked here by Svetlykovo, securing the flank and pushing the Russians away from the settlement. The Russians still control Derino and Nikolaevo Derino, which means that they still have this foothold across the river line. However, the Ukrainians are now counterattacking in the direction of Ubohovka, where they may be able to hit the supply lines of the Russians in this area, especially if they re-enter along the borderline. The Russians have yet to send additional forces here to the western flank, and this makes me believe that the Russians don't really have a serious intention of recapturing the Kursk region yet. And there are three main reasons for this. The first reason is that the incursion into the Kursk region by the Ukrainians redirects Ukrainian forces here to the north, where they are fighting in the Kursk region instead of the Donbass, where the Russians are slowly grinding down the Ukrainian defenses, and they've managed to capture several important strongholds of the Ukrainians, while the Ukrainians are facing a stalemate here in the Kursk region. The second reason is that it is within Russia, so the supply lines are much easier to deal with here rather than further south in the Donetsk region. And the third and final reason is that this really plays into the favor of Russian narrative, the Russian propaganda, as it shows what they have been saying for a long time. Ukraine is not just itself, it is supported by NATO, and they're looking to destroy Russia. That is what they want to show with the Kursk incursion. If the Russians weren't fighting in Ukraine, well, Ukraine would have just invaded us, sort of situation. But the longer the Ukrainians are present within Russia, like Russian territory across the borderline prior to 2014, then we will see that the Russian civilians will be more motivated to fight this war. There are even Russian civilians who do not support Putin, who openly say, I don't support Putin, but the Ukrainians are in my country, I need to defend it like the old generations, like my father before me, like my grandfather before him, and so on. So there is this militaristic resurgency within the Russian population that wasn't there a year ago, and this is likely due to the Kursk incursion. And as long as the Ukrainians remain there, there will be more motivation to fight, and there will be more motivation to sign up for military service. In the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance north of Pishane. They captured a single forest line. The reason this was reported is due to this geolocated footage showing this advance. In some areas of the front line, the Ukrainians have more than necessary of equipment, whether it is drones, artillery, or manpower. They have it available, and one of such front lines is the east of the Oskil River lines. Another one of such is the Kursk region. Then there are areas where they do not have the necessary equipment, such as the Donetsk front, because the Donetsk front simply requires that much more. This means that what they have, even if it is comparable to other regions, is not nearly enough because of how much pressure the Russians are exerting on the Ukrainian lines. An important factor is also the supply capabilities. It is much more reasonable for Ukraine to supply a large amount of supplies to Kupiansk compared to supplying a large amount of resources to much of the Donetsk front due to how close it is proximity-wise to the front line. Now that Pokrovsk is affected, it also limits the ability to send to Chasiv Yar, for example. Having to go through and supply the entire northern section of the front line from the same supply line, and with no additional support from the southern, they have to really send everything through the northern parts all across the Donetsk front to all of these different areas. That requires a lot of trucks, that requires a lot of movement and a lot of time, which the Ukrainians are suffering from a lack of. Even if the Ukrainians have a lot of it stockpiled, it is difficult to see exactly how much will actually arrive at the front line due to these bottlenecks in the supply. In the direction of Stelmakhivka, we see that the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of the settlement. With this, the Russians have full control over Stelmakhivka. This was reported by Deep State Map. So we see that the Russians have managed to secure this Stelmakhivka River line with this advance. This allows them to develop further offensive operations in the direction of Vishneve and to support offensive operations here further north by launching operations south of Berestove to connect with their positions by Pishane and then capture fortified positions one after another towards Losova, expanding the front line across the Stelmakhivka River line. The Ukrainians have a few positions here and there, mainly just acting as outposts where the Ukrainians can call in for support when they detect movement, sending drones or other equipment to hit any potential Russian advances. So we see that the Ukrainians here are mainly focused on having a few positions here and there, but the objective is simply to detect the Russians as early as possible to allow the Ukrainians to send the necessary firepower to halt the Russian advances and slow them down as much as possible. However, over the past few weeks, we have seen that the Russians have managed to advance closer and closer to the Oskil River line, reaching the outskirts of several settlements along the Oskil River line and advancing in multiple directions. This is another sign of the Ukrainians spreading out their forces too thinly. An interesting fact is that the Kharkiv direction has been fairly silent for a long time. There was this PR stunt by both sides in the aggregate plant, but other than that, there's been no significant developments. According to some rumors by Russian civilians near the border area between Kharkiv and Belgorod, the Russians are sending in reinforcements to that section of the front line to expand the pressure here in the Kharkiv direction, which makes sense as if the Russians don't exert enough pressure here in the Kharkiv direction, the Ukrainians will redirect their forces to other sections of the front line, which could slow down their advances. The Russians are looking to break through the Ukrainian defensive positions now that they are lacking both manpower and firepower. If that situation changes by the Ukrainians redirecting their forces or mobilizing enough soldiers to cover their losses and send additional forces to the front line, then the Russians would be in a position where their forces and offensive operations would slow down or even halt completely. And that is something that the Russians want to avoid. They want to get control over the entire defensive lines of the Ukrainians, and to do so they need to break through now that they have the chance, and that is what they're making full use of with their offensive operations across the front line, and especially in the Pokrovsk, Volodar, Kharkiv, Chasiv Yar directions. In the direction of Chasiv Yar, there is the first advance of the month, with a small Russian advance in the residential area in the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar. Naturally, the Ukrainians have well fortified these positions. Located on the high grounds, there's the canal to the east. All of these limits the Russian capabilities to conduct offensive operations within the settlement. But the Russians are not giving up their efforts. They are continuing this siege of Chasiv Yar. Heavy bombardments taking place all across the settlement, and the Russians are slowly inching forward. It will likely take much more time before the Ukrainians lose Chasiv Yar, as the Russians are not exerting enough force to speed up this process. Instead, what they're doing is that they're relying on positional fighting, setting up defensive positions in their foothold across the canal line before advancing further to establish a proper foothold. They noticed that as soon as they gained a wide foothold, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack to regain control of the positions, And this is actually a very old tactic described in the Art of War. If someone is conducting a river crossings, you don't attack them at the start. You wait until a lot of the forces are across before they conduct a counterattack by cutting off the crossing and limiting the supplies and capabilities of the army that crossed over before destroying the one on the side. The Ukrainians did this too early, where they attacked the crossings and they saw the effects of it. The Russians then made a very secure approach to the Battle of Chasiv Yar, where they're sending few troops, they're sending enough to hold the positions, establish the fortified areas, gain control over the flanks, secure the flanks, make multiple crossings before they start moving across. And this has significantly slowed down the Russian offensive, but it also made it much more secure, preventing the Ukrainians from attempting such an operation. And that is the general situation across the front line over the latest report in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It's been your host, Weeb Union. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my page for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.